All right, my clock shows 1 after the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started in the interest of allowing plenty of time for conversation. So good morning and welcome to this science seminar brought to you by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as SE CASC or the Southeast CASC. My name is Carrie Furness, and I am the University Assistant Director here at the Southeast CASC. I'm joined today by Kristen Fontana, Science Communications Fellow with us here. So in these virtual seminars, we're highlighting SE CASC work supporting resource management across the Southeast. So let me start with letting you know what to expect from today's webinar. We'll first go over some quick meeting logistics, request some feedback via a short poll, and then we'll introduce our speakers for today. They'll present for 40-45 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end before we wrap up. So now Kristen will give you a quick overview of our webinar technology.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen. So I'm just going to cover some Zoom basics. I'm pretty sure that we're all familiar with Zoom at this point, but we do recognize that folks do use different technologies. So I'm just going to point out a few things. The controls on the bottom left of your Zoom screen allow you to mute and unmute your audio. We will keep all lines muted and ask that you also keep your video off so that we can reduce distractions during the presentations. In the middle of the bottom bar, you can access the chat window, and I'd encourage you, if questions come up during the presentation, to submit them in the chat for discussion after the talk. We'll be monitoring questions there, and we'll pose them to our speakers during the Q&A session. We will also be recording today's webinar, and you can access and share the recording afterwards on the Southeast CASC website, on our Science Seminars webpage, and on our YouTube channel. Now we're going to launch a short poll just to get information about who is with us today and to help us know how to continue to get information out about these seminars.
Thanks, Kristen. So I've launched the poll and we'll give you just about 30 seconds or so to fill that out. And hopefully that'll give us an idea of who's with us in the room today, in the virtual room, and maybe give our presenters some input about how to structure their presentation. So lots of university folks, NGOs, federal agencies, yeah. And thank you all for reading the Southeast CASC newsletter. So I'll go ahead and end that. If you didn't have a chance to fill that out, feel free to put in the chat answers to those questions. And yeah.
Thank you everyone for filling this out and for feeding back this information. It's great to see the breadth of folks we have in our audience today. Now we'll turn over to our presentation, and while we switch over, Carrie will introduce our speakers.
Great, thanks. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Casey Thornbrugh and Dr. Steph Courtney. Casey is the Senior Tribal Climate Science Liaison for the Southeast and Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Centers and Program Manager for the Climate Program in the Office of Environmental Resource Management at the United South and Eastern Tribes Incorporated, otherwise known as USET. He serves as a liaison between tribes in the Northeast and Southeast, USET, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and climate science researchers to provide current climate science information, to identify climate research needs and priorities, and to provide climate adaptation planning support. Casey is a citizen of the Mashpee-Wampanoag tribe with an educational background in climate science. Steph is the Assistant Tribal Climate Science Liaison with USET, and she seeks to connect tribal nations and their staff with relationships, tools, and opportunities to improve their adaptation to climate change, with a focus on the tribal nations in the footprint of the Southeast CASC. Her PhD research examined how different audiences interpret and apply climate change science by applying social scientific methods to physical science subject matter. So the title of the presentation, as you see, is Tribal Climate Adaptation Priorities and Opportunities for the Southeast CASC. So now I'll turn it over to you, Casey.
Thank you, Carrie. Winnikisak, everyone. As noted in the intro, my name is Casey Thornbrugh, and I'll go ahead and get started here. Okay, so just a little overview of our presentation. We'll be covering a lot of content. So of course, we'll be giving an introduction to tribal nations and understanding tribal nations. We'll talk a little bit about the program that supports both Steph and I as liaisons, the BIA liaison program with the CASC and tribal organizations. I'll talk a little bit about our specific USET climate program within the organization. We'll mention tribal climate resilience success stories as we've come to learn about them. And examples of Southeast CASC tribal engagement. We'll conclude by discussing general priorities that we've been seeing from the engagement with tribal nation and some things to think about when collaborating with tribal nations. And we'll conclude with some resources that we have to share. So tribal nations have a unique relationship with the United States. And in the climate resilience or climate adaptation space, you'll see there are so many terms used. You hear frontline communities, you hear many types of terms. One of the things we wanted to share is the importance of understanding tribal nations as nations and what the trust and treaty obligation that the federal government of the United States has with tribal nations, why it's there, and why this makes working with tribal nations unique. So why does the United States have a trust and treaty obligation to tribal nations? Well, it is because tribal nations ceded millions of acres of land and natural resources to the United States. This was often involuntary or out of necessity to prevent the killing of our people who sought only to protect our families, our homelands, and our way of life. These ceded lands and natural resources are the very foundation of the wealth and power that the United States and its citizens enjoy to this day. In exchange, the United States made promises that exist in perpetuity to ensure Native people's health, overall well-being, and prosperity. This exchange is the basis for the general trust and treaty obligation to tribal nations and Native people. And this is from some of our educational materials in USET. So the trust and treaty obligation is the obligation of the federal government and all its branches and agencies to protect tribal nation self-governance, tribal lands, assets, resources, and treaty rights, and to carry out the directions of federal statutes and court cases. There's an example from the Supreme Court case back in 1942 that discusses the trust and treaty obligation as the highest responsibility of trust. And climate adaptation science interests fall into that as they are funded through a federal agency, through USGS and under the Department of the Interior. So it's really important to think of tribal nations as governments and as sovereign governments. One of my backgrounds is in geography. And when you look at maps of the United States, you usually see the states in political maps. And then depending on the maps and scales, you may see state capitals, major cities, sometimes transportation as well. A lot of times tribal nations are not shown on those maps, and that's an issue. And so when you think about the United States of America, it has a family of governments. So you of course have the federal government, you have states and state governments, and then you have federally recognized tribal nations and tribal governments. So we'll get into this a little bit more in the presentation, but most important is to understand your geography, or the geography in which you live and work in, and with creations of maps and services start to, if you're including states and if you're including municipalities, you need to include tribal nations. So tribal nations are inherent sovereigns. So that means sovereignty is not given. Sovereignty is something that we've always had from pre-contact on to now. It's assumed. And so basically this means that, our nations are autonomous. We have independent government authority, apart from any recognition of such authority by other entities. This authority includes jurisdiction over our people, lands, forms of government, administration of justice, and ultimately the right to make decisions that are the best interest of our citizens now and into the future. And that includes decisions on climate change adaptation. So we're going to go over some terminology in this presentation. And again, just to get everyone thinking about this in the right way. Often in climate adaptation work, the term stakeholder is widely used, and it's also widely used across the Climate Adaptation Science Center network and other climate institutions. We need to think about tribal nations as actually rights holders. So when you think about a stakeholder is an individual or a group or an organization that has a vested interest in an area, a sector, an ecosystem, or a species or product that stands to be impacted by climate change. A rights holder is a government or individual or individuals that have a constitutional, treaty, or inherent protected right to an area or to the well-being of an area, sector, ecosystem, or species that stands to be impacted by climate change. So it's very important to think of tribal nations as rights holders. All right, and I will hand it over to our assistant liaison, Dr. Steph Courtney.
Hello, yes. Yeah, I'm gonna keep going with some of these terms here. So we just talked about this, tribal nations as sovereign governments that fall within the US borders now, what we call the US. And so the map here that we're showing has the current federally recognized tribal nations that fall within the footprint of the Southeast CASC. So these are the nations that the CASC specifically works with, and that federal agencies in the Southeast have that trust and treaty obligation too. But click please, Kate. I didn't think about the animations with me not having clicking power, but we'll make it work. But many of these nations across the whole East, of course, were heavily impacted by Indian removal. So lots of the nations that they're still here in the footprint that through various processes and political decisions managed to stay in their homelands. They also share ancestry with tribal nations that are now removed, that are now often in Oklahoma and Indian Territory. So for example, we see on the map on the left, the Seminole tribe of Florida. That is one nation that is here now still within the Southeast. There's also a Seminole nation of Oklahoma, and they share ancestry, of course. They're both Seminole peoples, but at this point, they've been operating and living as separate governments for almost 200 years. So at this point, you have to be really careful about making sure, which you're talking to, distinguishing between them, being very clear with that in their legal nation names and all that good stuff, but also recognizing that they're in completely different climates and that they've been evolving as governments and peoples separately for centuries now. So they don't necessarily share any particular priorities as it occurs to climate change, that they might have different projects and priorities going on. So keeping that in mind, both for the sake of terminology and for collaborating with these different nations in different regions that have been impacted by removal. Next slide, please. So we've also talked about, we've thrown out federally recognized nations. These are the nations that have the federal trust and treaty obligations, which again, all federal departments and agencies are responsible towards, even though we associate it a lot with specific agencies like the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Education, but all are responsible. But we also recognize that a lot of folks here are not federal employees, and anyone in reality working with Indigenous nations in their area might come across the non-federally recognized nations. So North Carolina is a great example of this, because within the footprint of what we call North Carolina, there is one federally recognized nation. So that is the Eastern Band of Cherokee, that the federal government says, okay, we recognize you as a sovereign government and have that nation-to-nation relationship. But there are lots of state recognized nations. So that's some of the other colors here in the little map, the greens and blues, everything but yellow pretty much. So if you're working in a certain area, you might also have the opportunity to collaborate with those state recognized nations, or nations that don't, again, have recognition from any external body. They have inherent sovereignty still, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily are recognized by the state of North Carolina or whoever else. So if you're a federal employee, your obligation is to those federally recognized nations. But if you are a state employee or work otherwise on the ground with non-governmental organizations, you might have different flexibility and might have overlapping priorities with other Indigenous nations or groups. So it's just good to be aware of. Next slide, please. within each of those nations, of course, they are, governments who have a variety of agencies and departments. So this graphic from NCII is just an example. All of these different governments, have different ways of dividing up their agencies or different priorities, or might not have some of these agencies, totally depends. But for example, these are some of the government divisions that tribal nations might have, much like any of these other governments that we've been talking about. So in the CASC space, we often are working with the cultural resources departments and, archaeology and historical preservation offices, and definitely with natural resources, lands, and forestry, and those kinds of departments. But it's also, again, good to keep in mind that, of course, climate change impacts all aspects of society, and thus is the responsibility and concern probably of all aspects of government too. So any of these tribal nation governments can be thinking about and dealing with climate change in different contexts and agencies, and that's good to be aware of, that, again, there might be different priorities or opportunities to collaborate there. And then, of course, again, like in any other government setting, there's a lot of work being done within a government, and then there's also a lot of work being done outside of the government, in maybe smaller communities within a nation, maybe grassroots organizations that work within or across multiple nations. There's a lot of climate change work being done by different groups and different scales, even within the broad scope of what we might, broadly talk about as Indigenous peoples. Next. So again, we have lots of layers to talk about here. This is the one that sort of Casey and I fall into, basically, is that because the federal government has trust and treaty obligations to all of these federally recognized nations, there are tribal liaisons, usually the term, in pretty much every federal agency at some level or another. But the CASCs do it a pretty unique way, which is I think more effective, or at least very effective. I won't use a more or less statement. That within the CASCs, we are liaisons to the CASCs, and this program is funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, so in the graphic here on the left-hand side, but we are employed externally by an Indigenous nonprofit in our case. And in each of the different CASC regions, the liaisons are employed by nonprofits or universities in each of those regions. So this gives us a much more direct tie to those nations. Specifically for USET, it's our member nations. So this is just good to have that context, that we work in partnership with the USGS, with the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, and in partnership with the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, but we have a separate employer, which Casey will now talk about.
Awesome, thank you, Steph. So Steph and I are both employed by United South and Eastern Tribes, also known as USET. And USET is an intertribal organization, as you can see on the map here, with a pretty large geographic footprint or region. Currently serves 33 federally recognized tribal nations, all the way from the Northeastern Woodlands down through the Mid-Atlantic, far south as the Everglades, and across to the Gulf of Mexico. I believe the Alabama Coshawta tribe of Texas is the tribal nation that's furthest west in the region. USET had its origins in the 1960s, and so to put a little historical context to it, when people think about the 1960s, some of the things in history you have, like the civil rights movement and things of that nature at that time. For tribal nations, especially in the East, there was a big thing of we had to show the United States and the world that we're still here. I remember growing up as a child and sometimes acquiring kind of old dated textbooks that were written that basically showed conveyed like a non-existence of Indigenous communities or tribal nations in the East. And so one of the things that was done in the 1960s is, as tribal nations in the East who may or may not have a treaty with the United States government, because Some of our nations, the first contact was well before the United States was actually, became an actual country. So we had treaties and agreements with European nations. But in that time, many of Eastern nations are seeking federal recognition and showing the world that we're here and have always been here. So USET began with at the time 4 tribal nations: the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. And the tribal leaders from those 4 nations met on the Eastern Band of Cherokee homelands in 1968 and said, it's really difficult to kind of go one-on-one with the federal government and get the focus and attention required to meet the trust and treaty obligation. Why don't we form an organization? So we approach it. We still have the government-to-government relationship from nation to nation with the United States, but we also have a collective organization if we need to, through strength and unity, which you can see on the slide here is the motto, to make sure our priorities are met. So USET was more formally founded in 1969. We have many tribal nations that do join upon federal recognition. We have programs in environment, health, and economic development. There is also a sovereignty protection fund, which advocates for tribal nations within the USET region. We advocate also on issues that affect not only a region, but tribal nations nationally. There are many committees, often sector-based, that make up USET, such as natural resources and culture and historic preservation, which we tend to connect with most frequently. So USET has a mission, and that's to dedicating and enhancing the development of tribal nations and to improve the capability of tribal governments and improving the quality of life for Indigenous people through a variety of technical and supportive programmatic services. So within USET, there is a department, the Office of Environmental Resource Management, or OERM. And within that department, we have our climate change program. This developed out of the liaison work. Kind of started as a program of one. Yours truly, about when I began about 6 years ago. Being a liaison also means we're charged with putting tribal nations in contact with regional climate adaptation science centers, but also providing technical support at the request of a tribal nation or tribal agency. So that's what really cued this program to evolve as myself, as I was doing site visits and asking what are the priorities, what are the needs. Upon learning what those were, we within the Office of Environmental Resource Management acquired funding to deliver things like workshops, trainings, climate adaptation plan, and vulnerability assessment writing retreats as another example. So the program has grown. We have 2 full-time staff, which is Steph and myself. We have a part-time staff whose name is Tyler Everett, and he is the Forest Adaptation Technical Assistant. He is part-time while he is completing his PhD. And we have a graduate student intern working with us from Townsend University, Ha Shwan, who is working with us this year. And we will be bringing on an undergraduate intern. So our team is starting to grow, which enables us to respond to more of these technical support requests. The picture shown here is Climate Resilience Camp, which we began virtually in 2021. We had intended to do this in 2020, but as we all know, all in-person events were suspended for a couple of years due to the pandemic. These pictures are from our 2022 camp, which was hosted by the Wabanaki Dawnland, otherwise known as Dawnland Nations of Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq, and Holton Band of Maliseet Indians up in the space of Maine. So we held that camp there last summer, and brought USET member tribal nations together through their staff or climate adaptation points of contact and teams to work on what their priorities were for climate adaptation and to share this knowledge with each other, with other tribal nations in attendance, and other tribal organizations and CASC staff in attendance. This is funded through a grant from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So we are regularly utilizing funds or seeking funds to continue these type of technical support programs. As I mentioned, the pandemic, we still needed to, felt the need to make sure and provide technical support per request of tribal nations and including trainings and workshops, which other tribal nations could also benefit from. So we wrote a grant and were awarded to do a virtual U.S. Forests and Wetlands training webinar series. We wrote it in 2021 and we were awarded to implement the program in 2022. And as we all know, the world started to open up again in 2022. So, but we had made this commitment to offer a virtual training series on forest and wetland adaptations. And this was led by our forest adaptation technical assistant, Tyler Everett, where we arranged with tribal nations to do essentially virtual site visits, film them on what the priorities are, and have tribal presentations from these sites for an online series. So it was an example of tribal nations learning from each other on forest adaptation, what priorities were in forest, both in forest and wetland spaces. We have some video footage from it. So there's the QR code here if you're interested in seeing some of the work that we have done in there. So I want to mention some of the tribal climate resilience success stories that we've seen in the Southeast. And what we're seeing, for one example, I'd like to mention is the Seminole Tribe of Florida, which through their Office of Heritage and Environmental Resource Office, the acronym is HERO, they've dedicated full-time climate staff to bring the natural and cultural resources and other sectors important to the Seminole Tribe of Florida together to address climate change. And they have completed a vulnerability assessment for Seminole Tribe of Florida homelands and areas susceptible to the impacts of climate change. And so it's in review right now by the tribal government, but it's a wonderful story of partnerships and working together. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on that as the Southeast CASC and staff from Southeast CASC were involved in that as well. Across the board, if you were to map tribal nations out of adaptation plans and vulnerability assessments, you might see like more dots on the map in like the Midwest and West and Alaska. But I want to point out that a lot of vulnerability assessments and adaptation work is going on in the East. Not all of it may be published, but it's going on the ground. So that's why I distinguish between formal and informal work. So we, are starting to see more formal published vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans in the East and in the Southeast. But many tribal nations are continuing to garner resources to work on these right now in live time. We're also seeing tribal nations reacquire land. Again, if you look on a map and if you just look at like trust lands, you're going to see that the number of trust lands in terms of acreage is smaller in the East than you find in other parts of the U.S. However, tribal nations are reacquiring lands and putting lands back into trust. And what that means is we say, it's all our cultural lands, but having lands in trust gives us a little more ability to make direct decisions in jurisdiction, including decisions on how to adapt to climate change. So some recent examples are the Upper Mattaponi Indian tribe, which reclaimed 866 acres, and the Rappahannock tribe. Both of these tribal nations are USET member tribal nations. And Rappahannock tribe, which reacquired 465 acres. Lastly, I'll mention, in working with tribal nations and adaptation planning, the scale often is time scale is much longer. When we look at things such as the National Climate Assessment or other resources and tools, we look at projections of like the 30 years, 50 years, or what things, whether it's sea level rise, for example, may look like 2100. We have tribal nations that are working to make plans for more than 100 years out. And of course, there's challenges because, you know, the further out you go, the less certain you have with projections and how things are going to look. But tribal nation planning tends to be multi-generational. So you'll hear often, like, you know, the 7 generations, 7 generations that led us to where we're at now. And then what plans can we put into place to ensure well-being for ourselves, lands, and communities for 7 generations down the road. So climate change adaptation planning tends to be longer in time scale. We have challenges across the region. And some of those challenges include capacity. How many staff do you have dedicated to doing a climate change adaptation plan? As I was saying in the beginning of the presentation, looking at tribal nations as nations with agencies. So whether the agency, like an environmental or natural resources, has like 30 staff, or it might have 1 or 2 staff, they're nevertheless responsible for caring and seeking the best interests of these resources for a tribal nation. But sometimes the person or people doing the vulnerability assessment or adaptation plan are wearing many hats and needing to respond to immediate responsibilities while working to get these plans done. So the Southeast CASC, in my time working with the Southeast CASC, which is coming up almost on 6 years, there's been various examples of engagement and relationship building with tribal nations and agencies. And so one example is doing outreach and making sure there's the opportunity for tribal nation staff from tribal agencies to attend, participate, and even present at Southeast CASC Science Symposia. So one of the first ones I had the opportunity to be a part of was in 2019, which was held in New Orleans. And so we had we had presentations from Mississippi Band of Choctaw, Indians Environmental Division, Eastern Band of Cherokee, Natural Resources Division as well. And then more recently, last September, with the Science Symposium held at Gulf Shores, again, bringing tribal nations for those presentations, but taking it to the next level in terms of setting time aside for tribal specific meetings with leadership of the CASC to really drill down into what tribal priorities are on the ground. We've had site visits with tribal nations in my time, and I'll give one example here coming up. And attending annual tribal meetings and conferences. When there are open meetings or when you're invited to go to these meetings, is an opportune time to network, to have some face-to-face time with tribal managers, learn what some of the priorities are, and maybe even see if a site visit would be helpful to do. And then recently in this year, and Steph has been tremendous help in building our capacity in our climate program and working with the CASC and liaison program to be able to do this, but to communicate and have conversations with tribal nation agencies and staff. And we like to use conversation because I think whether you're meeting or you're, eventually if you go to like a site visit or things like that, before you make plans on how a partnership is going to work, it's really important to learn about one another and to debunk any assumptions that people may be going in with. So having these conversations allows for that a little bit more openness, building relationships and starting to build trust. So there's an understanding before a partnership or projects become formal. So we really push on, having conversations and building in time to build relationships before seeking more formal agreements. And sometimes in the grant space, that there's not like a match between that. And so that probably has to be rectified in some way. But again, relationship building is really important. We've had Southeast CASC and North Carolina State University staff support working with the Seminole Tribe of Florida in the vulnerability assessment. Again, I'll go into that as an example after this slide. Recently this year, United South and Eastern Tribes, USET, we have joined the Southeast CASC Consortium Partnership. There is a trend across the country where we have, usually consortium partnerships are primarily made up of universities within a region, but we're starting to see intertribal organizations, tribal colleges, and sometimes tribal nations join in as partnerships in CASC consortia across the country. So in the East, we now have USET as part of the Southeast CASC partnership for these next 5 years. And then lastly, research project scoping and planning, working with tribal nations. And that, again, coming back to the relationship, where we have affiliated researchers and staff and principal investigators as part of the Southeast CASC, working on projects or proposing projects and working with tribal nations to do so. When there's a relationship there, it helps with that. But that relationship building is a really important step. But also where we have USET as a CASC consortium member, that means USET member tribal nations or agencies within tribal nations can make proposals and lead proposals for the competitive funding opportunities each year that highlight a priority that they would like to work on and seek other partnerships as they would like see fit or in the best interest of their projects. So that is with the research scoping and planning and working with tribal nations and agencies. Okay, I like to highlight an example I've had the opportunity to be a part of over the past several years, and that's the work with the Seminole Tribe of Florida. So this was evolved into a site visit with myself and staff from the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center and postdocs from North Carolina State University. And this site visit happened because of it was an invitation from the tribal agency. It started really in, I think, 2018, again, through a meeting and conversations at a tribal meeting. I made a presentation on the liaison program and USET and the Southeast CASC. And I was tapped by a consultant who working with the Seminole Tribe of Florida, who is professional and personal, become a professional personal friend in this work. And he had communicated with the Seminole Tribe of Florida Hero office and said, they're doing this really interesting work, and do you think we should link with them? To which we were, myself and Southeast CASC staff were invited to come to a site visit. And that's really important. When there's an invitation there, it's so important to take it up because site visits are really big deals. A lot of times the idea of a site visit might come from outside the tribe, and maybe it is the trust and treaty obligation. So you're trying to make sure you're doing the work in the most effective way. But when there is a site visit, that means tribal staff usually take time from their jobs to host whoever the visitor is and to give these tours and do all these things. So folks are doing that with the hope that it's going to yield a benefit, for the tribe and doing these things. So taking site visits very seriously is really important. So we were invited to go down. Myself, the then university assistant director, Dr. Lorenzo Lascarain, and laboratory manager, Lauren Nichols, went down through the invitation. And we met with the Seminole Tribal Florida Heroes staff, a staff that's multicultural. Some are citizens of the Seminole Tribe of Florida. Others are not, but are nevertheless employed to make sure the care of tribal resources are held to the utmost highest level. And so they brought us to different habitats, locations of highest concern for the tribe. We also went in and looked at the map of all the places that we went. And long story short, you know, trying to keep an eye on time here, that went into having two staff and postdocs from North Carolina State University work with the Seminole Tribe of Florida on the development of the vulnerability assessment, which is now complete. The vulnerability assessment was such an exercise of internal work from the tribal nation to do community engagement, and that was respected to be an internal thing. And then some of the external work, which was using our resources to look at the climate change projections or look at what those means for habitat types in Florida, and bringing all that together. So it was a really good example and very resilient. We dealt with government shutdowns, we dealt with pandemics, all these things that affected the project, but nevertheless, the vulnerability assessment still was completed. All right, I'll send it back over to Steph for the science priorities.
Yeah, so we talked about in a couple of ways here, both all of this time that we've spent having really tailored conversations with tribal nations and agencies about their climate change concerns. And again, a part of our liaison job is to connect to the CASC, which primarily funds research. So a big and an important part of our whole partnership here is making sure we understand what science would really support tribal nations in their climate change planning and adaptation, what still needs to be researched, essentially, where that is the barrier, if that is ever the limiting factor. So this is a pretty, broad list that I put here just to share some of the things that we've been talking about and noticing, and that, could be research priorities if you're looking for new work to get into, perhaps. So the first one I have listed is current species distribution and biodiversity, basically being that, of course, these nations want to understand which species are already present, what might be there for protecting or be vulnerable, but sometimes don't even know the total distribution of what's on their land. It takes a long time just to go out and do an assessment of what you already have on your land. Maybe if there's any endangered species that you just haven't quite found on the land yet. Maybe if there's culturally important species that are only in a few limited locations or on neighboring land that could be doing well on your land as well. Just getting a good handle of the current status before we see more and more climate changes is a big priority. This one is, tougher to do from a research angle, but there has been some relevant social science work about, just as I think any government probably is facing challenges, and in academia, we talk about this too, being able to cross the silos that are sometimes built up between different departments, different agencies, people working on different priorities, when again, we know that climate change affects all of them, and that coming into collaboration to better understand what priorities are shared or what projects might be good to collaborate on. So there's some social science that can address that too, especially that the Southeast has been working on, which has been great to be a part of. A big one is data gaps and data availability. This is, again, across the Southeast, I think, definitely beyond tribal nations. This has been a big discussion for example, the Caribbean, and pretty much anywhere that's not coastal in the Southeast. This has been a big discussion of being able to get just the baseline data, having high quality data for projections and for modeling, but also for management, having quick access to that data, real-time data, if possible, is really helpful for being able to make decisions, especially for, increasing tides and sunny day flooding, things that are more on a day-to-day basis that happen quickly, and the quicker you can get information about it is really helpful. And then, I've also put inland. I've heard it phrased as like, there's lots of work already done on the mountains, lots of work already done on the coasts, not necessarily on the Piedmont. So that's one way of thinking about it, where we just need to know more for the modeling and planning in understudied areas, which have a lot of different contexts in the Southeast. Another one is migration. You know, we talk about definitely of non-human relatives of species migrations with changing climates, including non-local or invasive species, but also of humans that we know, you know, that the Southeast has most of the fastest growing cities in the country, and especially in the Piedmont, the expansion of, you know, the big Southeastern cities, Charlotte, Atlanta, many others, that how those populations move is definitely going to affect tribal nations and their governance as well. Movement away from the coasts, again, the sort of Piedmont and inland areas, that this all affects the ecosystems and the economies of tribal nations, and understanding this better can definitely help with management there. And then I'm going a little deeper into one example. If you haven't heard of it, I feel like everyone who gets into river cane kind of becomes an evangelist about it to some degree. That so that's a picture on the left here, my hand with some river cane. River cane is one of the 3 to 4 native bamboo species, and there's just a lot that's not fully understood about it, and so I'm gonna highlight that there. Next slide, please, Casey. That it's a species that is just super culturally important to pretty much every nation and culture of Indigenous peoples in the Southeast, primarily because of the basketry there you can see in the center of this picture. So this is an image that is produced by the Revitalization of Traditional Cherokee Artisan Resources, RTCAR. It's a collaboration between Eastern Band of Cherokee and North Carolina State University. So I just liked that they had this graphic here in both English and Cherokee. And, you know, there's lots of course, important species in the Southeast, but this is one that is really amazingly shared because it used to have a huge, huge geographic range, if you see there in the bottom left. And nowadays, river cane is down to about, it's 2 to 3% of that historic range. So if you look at the earliest written records of you know, colonizers in the Southeast, basically, they would talk about miles-long stretches of these 20-foot high cane breaks, which is what you call the dense thicket of cane. And that is not the case anymore. It's much harder to find. And it's just, I think it's a good illustration because it's this really critically important native species that a lot of people haven't even heard of, even though it used to cover the Southeast. And that I put it as a research priority because there's so much we don't know. We don't know about, you know, how often it seeds and how to reproduce it that way. Sometimes it's been observed to only go to seed every like 30 years. And this picture on the left here shows some of its outgrowth. This was just, you know, even the people who are deep into river cane are saying, okay, we think if we mow the patch around the break, then it'll be able to expand really well. And so this picture, you'll see 2 like linear kind of sets of these columns of the cane, and those just popped up in the last like 2 months since they did a big mow. I was out there last week actually, and got a picture there. So just, yeah, especially with climate change, it's just a good illustration that there's this critically important Indigenous species that we don't know pretty much anything about its salt tolerance, about its heat tolerance, about the seeding and spreading. So I think that's, yeah, it's just a good example of the many topics that are still out there to understand better, that are important to the Indigenous peoples of the Southeast and are great opportunities for research and for collaboration. Next slide, please. So there's a lot to kind of throw into the last few minutes here. I'll try to go fast, but also, you know, be thorough, be thoughtful. We wanted to give a quick little collaboration from 10,000 feet, just some sort of tips for if you're thinking about engaging with tribal nations and building those collaborations. So the first one, of course, is consider why you want to start that engagement or collaboration. So some folks, of course, again, federal employees have a trust and treaty obligation to do so. Many people just have an interest in engaging with Indigenous peoples, or who might work with a nonprofit or something that provides specific services and want to make sure that those are also extended to Indigenous peoples and nations in the area. But all of these are going to have different, you know, aspects, different contexts. It's going to look differently, and you need to know what angle you're coming from. And, in all reality, there's a lot more funding opportunities these days that encourage engagement with Indigenous peoples, or the federal requirements that require that Indigenous knowledges be included. If you are wanting to engage Indigenous nations for those purposes to benefit your proposal, you need to be honest about that and thoughtful about that, and not try to hide it and essentially be furthering research colonization in doing so. That's the long and short of it, a quick way to say it. Next one, please. So federal folks have their obligation to consult. That's what we talk about a lot, is that, most federal agencies know they have to do consultation, which is just consulting with tribal nations about decisions that might impact them. But that is the very lowest bottom requirement. There's only up to go from there to true good collaboration. For example, being aware of certain principles like free, prior, and informed consent, and learning about those principles and how they might apply to collaborations with Indigenous peoples is, again, necessary. That's still a low bar that you have to meet if you want to do this engagement. But really, the goal should be in this collaboration, full collaboration, co-creation. We talk about co-production, that you want to be engaging in projects that are co-designed by the Indigenous nation to be sure that it's also providing equal benefit to that nation. So there's lots and lots of resources out there on these kinds of ideas, and that's something you can certainly email us about for more resources. But just keeping in mind that there's always ways to do it better and lots of resources to do so. Next bullet. Of course, just learning what you can about the different nations. We talked about how, there might be similar names between multiple nations, but you need to, understand, recognize, and research the fact that they are independent governing bodies with different priorities, different histories, and be aware of that before you start emailing them to just say, what do you guys want to work on? Or, do your research, do your homework. That creates better collaboration, and also just shows that you have a genuine interest and care, and that you can be deliberate and thoughtful in doing this work. It shows your character and prioritization of the work if you come in knowing this stuff ahead of time and doing your own research. And last, the one that really sums it all up, advancing sovereignty. Any additional, information or research that the nations engage in is, for them at least, about advancing their sovereignty. Any research they undergo needs to have sovereignty baked into each of the steps. One of those big topics is data sovereignty, which is, again, another Googleable term if you're looking for more resources. That anytime you're engaging with an Indigenous nation, their number one priority is going to be to assert their sovereignty and make decisions, informed decisions that are best for their citizens, and to make those decisions and advance their self-governance. All that, again, is a lot of sort of terms thrown into one to represent these really big, critically important ideas, but that is our 10,000 foot view. Yeah, I think that'll sum it up. And last, of course, like I said, there's lots of ways to learn more, lots of other resources. So Casey at the very beginning quoted from our USET educational book. This is how to find that on the USET webpage. Then there's a library button, and then you can find the educational book under the USET publications. And next slide, please. We have our climate change page where we have a lot of different resources. We update events, we update little news stories. We have examples of public facing adaptation, well, especially, I guess, vulnerability assessments from some USET member nations, mostly more up north. So there's lots to learn there too, and we are continually updating that. So with that, thanks for listening. Now that we've talked a lot here, I hope it was helpful, and we will maybe have time for a question or two.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steph and Casey. This is really a huge amount of information. And before we start with questions, I just want to say thank you very much for sharing all of this. We do have lots of stuff in the chat, so we'll go ahead and start working through there and get where we can get. And hope that you'll be open to people contacting you afterwards if needed. But, so one question that has come through is, do you work with any peoples from Puerto Rico or USVI?
So we do not. Our work right now is with the 33 tribal nations of USET, which are on the mainland, if you will, and federally recognized tribal nations of that space.
Yeah, to my knowledge, there are no federally recognized nations in the Caribbean. Yeah, and it may be that there are some indigenous communities, and we have worked in touch with folks who are representatives, but nothing in a way to call out, I guess, at this point. Yeah, so thank you for that. And thank you for putting in, Steph, the link you'll notice in the chat, folks, that to the a direct link to the Forest and Wetlands webinar training series. So next question from Sarah. Do you have any resources you can share on the Seminole Tribe Florida Vulnerability Project? I work in Florida on a vulnerability project and very interested in learning more. So is there a way to connect to that effort?
Yeah, so at present, like I said, the vulnerability assessment's in review in the tribal government. And so, you know, should tribes make that information public, it's their prerogative to do so. But I would just say stay tuned. I can say that there's definitely discussion engagement from Seminole Tribe of Florida and adjacent governments, because climate change is going to impact South Florida or in Florida. That's just what's happening. So stay tuned for those and just kind of look out for those engagements.
Great. Thanks. So what is the best way to connect with your organization? I know y'all put your contact information on that last page. I think, if I can speak for you guys, that directly contacting you as our tribal climate liaisons is appropriate, and then you can help connect them to other resources through USET or potentially other tribal nations. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, so like I said, the web pages that were shared, you can start with those to see like USET events. I'll just say with direct contact, you know, we would respond to the best of our ability. Just wanted the audience to understand that our first priority is responding to the technical support requests from tribal nations, and then the CASC network for connecting with those. So sometimes it might be a minute or longer till we get to that. So just if that's understood, but that's why I said, please do see the website, do see the events that are happening. If you have a question on something, if it's public or not and can register, those are pretty quick turnarounds. So we should be able to respond to that. Steph, do you have anything to add?
No, yeah, I do. I mean, people could sign up for, like USET has programmatic alerts, but that, you know, comes from a lot of different departments. So if you want to keep an eye on what we're doing in the climate program specifically, the webpage is really the best way to do that.
And I do want to call out the Southeast CASC website and some of the tribal, we have a tribal partners page and specifically some tribal resources, but hopefully there you could find connections as a Western scientist or as a tribal partner, how you might engage best with some of the work at the CASC and that Casey and Steph coordinate. So we are at the top of the hour, but there are lots of comments and questions still in the chat. So how do you want to go forward with those? Do y'all want to try to deal with those? We do want to just give a quick announcement about an upcoming seminar that's actually geared, we hope, towards some tribal managers as well as other folks in the Southeast. If we could show that up. Yeah, so this you can also find if you get our newsletter or go to our website, information about this. Steph has been instrumental in helping coordinate this, but this is a workshop that's upcoming and is co-hosted by the U.S. Forest Service, the South Central CASC, and the Southeast CASC. So that'll be coming up in September, so with multiple presenters, so that should be a good one. And also keep an eye out for other upcoming SE CASC science seminars. are you guys able to hold for a few minutes and work if other folks can and continue the conversation, or would you rather follow up after the fact with perhaps some questions?
So what I propose is I have a couple minutes I could stay on, and then Steph, I'm looking at the questions in the chat. If there's some that you see that I would like to respond to, please go for it. I'll respond to just one I see from on navigating funding, working with non-federally recognized tribes. So I have been, as a liaison, contacted, sometimes by organization working or proposing to work with a non-federally recognized tribe and related to that question. So what in our current role, so we don't provide that direct technical support, but what I try to do is make some of those connections. So sometimes with non-federally recognized tribes, there are state programs, or there are philanthropic organizations that provide some of those. Sometimes I also try to recommend some other networks to be a part of. One I'm particularly fond of is the Rising Voices Network. They work with federally recognized tribes, also non-federally recognized tribes that are part of that network, Pacific Island nations, indigenous nations in the Caribbean. It's very broad, so it's a good network to queue into. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks. Steph, are you able to stay on for another couple of minutes, or?
Yeah, I was just typing one out, but I realized it could just be verbal. Do we liaise with other federal agencies beyond the CASCs? Sort of, kind of, of course, again, climate change is across agencies and topics and whatnot. So we attend some of the EPA tribal working group meetings. There is a Park Service tribal working group meeting. So as we have capacity, we'll keep aware of what these other agencies are doing, because again, of course, it's all relevant. But no formal liaising to those others, but it always helps to keep up with what everybody's working on.
Yeah, great. One last question is, do you do outreach to tribal ag producers? And then we'll
well, we have a USET agriculture technical assistant also within the environmental resources group. So we, that would be David Anderson. He works mostly with that. We do, talk with him. It's relevant. Ag and climate is an area that I have interest in. So, within USET, yes.
Great. Thank you. Well, we'll go ahead and call it. I'll make sure that you have access to these chat notes, because there was some contact information in there, and then we can figure out if there's follow-up to be done. Glad to help with that as needed. So again, thank you very much for being on with us, for providing this information, for answering questions, and thanks for holding steady for those who are still with us, and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Awesome.
Thank
Take
you,
care. Have a good day, everybody.